Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Peter Jennings is my name. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And thank you all for coming out on what looks like perhaps the last really cold winter's night we're going to have in Canberra. I thought that was all over, and then there's always just that last little sting in the tail in terms of Canberra's winter. But it's going to be, I think, an intellectually warm gathering here this evening to listen to the Hon Peter Dutton MP, Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for coming on and for offering to give us this speech. I'd like to acknowledge Roman Quadling, the Commissioner of Border Force, and I know I don't think he's here quite right now, but Mike Pizzullo, I think the Secretary of the Department, is also going to be coming in very soon. Now, in particular, I would like to thank UNISIS for their support this evening. Many of you would know that ASPI is an organisation which relies on government support and sponsorship in order for us to do our work. And it certainly is true, Tony, that we literally couldn't do this without you, so I do appreciate it and the work that UNISIS does with us and for the wider national security establishment. Now, the way the role play will, or the batting order will unfold this evening is that Tony Windever, the UNISIS Vice President and General Manager for Asia Pacific and Japan, will introduce the Minister. The Minister will then speak. A little bit after 6, I will come back to moderate questions and answers. A reminder to all that this is a public event, as the appearance of the cameras in the back of the room would indicate. I'll make some closing remarks around about 6:20 or so, and then it would be really good if you could join us for some drinks and the famous ASPI canapes out in the entry to the Institute. So that's the plan, and right now if I could ask you to please welcome Tony Windever from UNISIS. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Peter. Well, on behalf of UNISIS Australia, I'm delighted to welcome the Honourable Peter Dutton, who will be speaking to us on the challenges of border security and refugees. Now, these important and sensitive issues require the government finding a balance between ensuring our national borders remain secure while simultaneously enabling the smooth transit of bona fide travellers and cargo to and from Australia. Now, at the same time, the government is faced with the challenge of managing a policy architecture to deliver orderly processing and proper determination of the claims of people seeking refugee status in Australia. Now, in Australia and elsewhere, the events since the millennia have driven a sharper and contentious edge to policy debates on border security and refugee policy. Terrorist threats and attacks in our region and globally have put pressure on our border security agencies. Significant additional resources have been allocated to our border protection and security and counter-terrorism agencies. But the challenges aren't limited to combating terrorism. According to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, people trafficking is the world's fastest growing global crime. Furthermore, stolen passports, fraudulent travel documents, resource constraints and information overload add to the problem. In addition, migrant flows are significantly increasing due to instability in regions such as the Middle East and North Africa. Governments, including ours, are confronted with thousands of refugees looking for safety and asylum. Meanwhile, the volume of international arrivals to Australia has steadily increased since 2006. In the year ending June 2016, there were 18.2 million arrivals to Australia. While most international travellers and export-import businesses understand and accept the need for increased security measures at arrival and departure points, there is increasing demand for faster and easier border clearance arrangements. The myriad of policy challenges in border security, counter-terrorism, cybersecurity, immigration and refugees, together having to respond to the commercial need to faster border clearance arrangements for travellers and cargo, is a daunting agenda for Australian governments to balance. Now, at the border, information technology will play an increasingly vital role in providing real-time mechanisms to oversee human and cargo border entry and exits. Real-time advanced analytics and biometric identity verification allows governments to access critical information to more quickly process visitors. the vast majority of whom present no threat, while strengthening the security checks of those travellers deemed to be of higher risk. Now, Unisys is proud of our work with governments around the world to secure their air, land and sea borders. For example, we developed and operate the automated targeting system used by US Customs to perform continuous risk assessments of all people and cargo entering the US. And further, we built and we maintain the vehicular and pedestrian border clearance solutions deployed to over 100 ports of entry on the US-Mexico and US-Canada border. Now, here in Australia, Unisys has a strong and ongoing relationship working with the Minister's Department to provide its biometric solution to prevent visa fraud. And we provide end-user computing services for more than 15,500 DIBP staff nationally and in more than 60 locations overseas. But enough, though, about Unisys. Minister, all of us here today are well aware of your parliamentary and ministerial career to date. However, given your current ministerial responsibilities, what I've found to be of particular interest is that you served as a police officer for 9 years prior to entering Parliament. You therefore bring experience from the security and law enforcement coalface, including time with the National Crime Authority. We look forward to your contributions to ASPI today. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Peter Dutton.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for your warm welcome. It's a great privilege to be here with so many distinguished guests and friends. ASPI, of course, has made an invaluable contribution over the past 15 years to Australian public debate, been ahead of the game, and I say thank you so much for Peter, for you being here.
Close the caps! 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 Dutton, please, close the caps, man. Close the caps! 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 Close the caps!
Hear us, Dutton. Close manners. Close now, rude. Shame on you. Enough is enough. The whole world torturing children and adults who sought our help. Shame on you.
Well, now I thought Michael Bazzullo being late would have dealt with these issues before his arrival, but can I say thank you very much, Peter, for having us here tonight. Thank you to all that are present. Tony, thank you very much to you and to the role that your company plays. I want to pay a special tribute and acknowledgement tonight to senior members of the department who are here, in particular, of course, Michael Bazzullo, the Secretary, to Roman Quadvlik, the Commissioner, and to say thank you to them and to the senior members of the department for their dedication to public service and leadership in a very significant area of Commonwealth service delivery. Our governments are charged with a very significant responsibility for their nation's security and prosperity and must act with cool heads and clear eyes. They must be mindful that the choices they make will have ramifications that will be felt for many years to come. Only by resisting populist and simplistic rhetoric do we have the ability to make the right decisions based on sound logic, principle and tested practice, and to give our country the best chance to succeed. It is fair to say that governments and nations today face challenges of a scale not seen in many decades. The stakes for getting decisions right are very high. Governments that fail to deliver security and territorial integrity risk weakening the societies they represent. In such an environment, with increasing economic and security vulnerabilities, further failure inevitably follows. In the coming days, the Prime Minister and I will attend the high-level refugee and migration summits at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. The summits are a direct response to the international crisis that continues to unfold, most horribly on the waters of the Mediterranean. Australia is a migration superpower. We have secure borders, and at the same time, we have provided for people in a humane way and have presided over one of the most successful modern-day migration programs anywhere in the world. Australia has a great migration story to tell. The United Nations estimates that 65 million people are displaced worldwide. We are seeing the largest movements of displaced persons since the Second World War. In Europe, the numbers are staggering. According to Eurostat data, 1.3 million people applied for asylum in European states last year. This was almost double the previous high water mark set in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. At the same time, there is an even bigger push for migration, people driven by aspiration rather than persecution. And the intermingling of these groups makes the challenge even greater, particularly when it comes to realising the core objectives of the Refugee Convention. The German government has said that more than 1.1 million asylum seekers entered their country last year alone, following that nation's decision to open its doors. The flow of asylum seekers through the Balkans into Bavaria reached a dangerous fever pitch before recently being curbed by a succession of decisions by the Turkey and Balkan states to attempt to regain control of their borders. The destabilisation that has beset Europe is plain for all to see. We've observed obvious problems with social cohesion and a deteriorating security environment. We've seen cosmopolitan cultural centres rocked by unspeakable moments of terror. The Belgian government recently stated that terrorism has cost their country close to €1 billion in lost business and tax revenue, with major impacts recorded in tourism and hospitality. Paris's tourism industry took a massive hit in the wake of attacks in that city. Travellers have become wary of Europe's chaos. Uncontrolled migration is not the only cause of Europe's current woes, but it is undoubtedly a major challenge to the European project. These large movements are also in themselves perilous. Only 2 weeks ago, the Italian Coast Guard reported rescuing almost 10,000 migrants from the Strait of Sicily over the course of just 3 days. The International Organisation for Migration believes that there are nearly 3,000 migrants who tragically lost their lives in the Mediterranean in the first 6 months of this year. Now, Australians empathise with the predicament and the aspirations of those moving to Europe, and indeed with Europe itself. We've seen firsthand the disastrous consequences that flow from weak borders. We've seen the real-world impacts of ill-considered government decision-making played out on a grand and terrible scale. History will record with a black mark the half-decade of dysfunction unleashed on our migration program from 2008 to 2013. As an island nation, in Australia the challenges we face are undoubtedly different, but they are no less serious. And make no mistake, if we again surrender our sovereignty to people smugglers who are motivated by profit rather than the aims of the Refugee Convention, desperate people will again die. Therefore, it is a moral imperative that Australia's borders remain secure. In 2008, the newly elected Rudd government, acting without any strategic foresight, set about systematically dismantling Prime Minister Howard's highly effective suite of border protection measures. Boat turnbacks, regional processing and temporary protection visas were cast aside in favour of a feel-good approach to border security, and it was a fatal error. And it put out the welcome mat for people smugglers. Nobody in our country will ever forget the catastrophe that followed. 50,000 people arrived on more than 800 boats and 1,200 people drowned at sea. 8,000 children ended up in detention, 17 new detention centres opened, and there was an $11 billion border protection blowout. Mistakes, even the gravest, are quickly made, but their legacy takes time and determination to correct. Nothing has done more damage to our migration program in such a short period of time as the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd government did in those few turbulent years. When the Coalition took office in September 2013, we inherited a legacy caseload of more than 30,000 asylum seekers. The asylum claims of around 24,000 of those people had not even begun to be processed, and despite some having arrived as early as August 2012. In the years since 2013, we have taken back control. This was achieved through the resolute implementation of a comprehensive plan. On coming to government, Prime Minister Abbott established Operation Sovereign Borders and reintroduced Howard-era policy settings that had been proven to work. We have made the tough calls, including turning back boats where it's safe to do so. As of tonight, 740 people from 29 people smuggling vessels have been intercepted and returned safely to their country of departure. But it is important to note that had those boats made it through our ring of steel, hundreds of boats would have followed in their wake. Now, following a drawn-out legislative battle, we successfully reintroduced temporary protection visas in December of 2014. TPVs and Safe Haven Enterprise visas have deprived people smugglers of a product to sell and enabled us to begin working through Labor's legacy caseload. I'm advised that on the basis of processing to date, that as many as 1/3 or more could be found not to be owed protection. The size and varied nature of the caseload means these trends may deviate over time, though if they hold, it would equate to about 10,000 to 12,000 economic migrants, not refugees, who paid people smugglers to bring them to our country. Many of these people will likely refuse to return to their home country unless we act. They will remain a burden on the Australian taxpayer. We remain engaged with several countries to alleviate these issues, but negotiations will necessarily be protracted. Now, regional processing has been critical to removing any incentive for people smugglers to undertake the dangerous voyage in an attempt to reach Australian soil. In the face of sustained activist opposition, we have maintained regional processing centres on Manus Island and Nauru. Our relationship in this regard with Nauru will continue for decades. While the boats may have stopped, the spectre of people smuggling remains ever present in our region. We know, for instance, that there are 14,000 people in Indonesia alone who would board a boat to Australia today if our border protection policies were weakened, and it would be just the start. We know that there is significant chatter coming out of other countries. People smugglers will not go quietly into the night. They are ruthless and sophisticated criminals. They diligently follow the asylum seeker debate in this country, looking intently for any opportunity to restart what was a $500 million industry. And whatever decisions we make, we must always cast an eye on potential pull factors and the consequences that may follow. Nothing in this space happens in a vacuum. Australia's border protection measures, however successful, are not without their critics. And whilst I do not for 1 minute deny that there have been issues in our strained detention and processing networks, our detractors do no service to anyone by trading in false hope and speaking in disingenuous terms. Their entreaties to a different approach offer nothing but a holiday from history and ignore the fundamental reality that secure borders require policies that are both tough and fair. If they are not tough, then they will not be fair to those people who are desperately waiting in camps, and they will not be morally fair to those who will again be lured to the murky depths by the siren call of people smugglers. And mistakes were made, but it has been the coalition that has done the most to fix them. No government has done more to restore the integrity of our detention network. My proudest achievement as Minister has been getting all children out of detention. We've closed 17 detention centres, and we're working to remove people from detention across the network, except for those who are deemed a risk to the community. And the reality is that the system of detention was put under enormous pressure by the previous government's mismanagement, and we continue to deal with the litany of legacy issues to this day. Even if every IMA was resettled today, our job would be far from over. The hard truth is that Australia has been placed firmly and forever on the people smugglers' map. Despite any challenges that we face, we must maintain the policies that have worked and that have stopped the deaths at sea. So let me be clear. Anyone who attempts to come to Australia by boat will never be settled here permanently. No one on Manus Island or on Nauru will ever be settled in this country. And it is a tough message, but it is a fair message, and it's one that needs to be heard. It's a message that only a responsible government can ever deliver. This does not mean that Australia is not a generous and compassionate nation. A direct dividend of these policies has been increased public support for our orderly migration and humanitarian programs that have long contributed to our nation's cultural and economic development. This has allowed Australia to maximise its role as a responsible global citizen. Renewed integrity in the system has enabled the government to deliver the largest offshore humanitarian intake of the last 30 years. In 2015-16, the Commonwealth issued 17,555 humanitarian program visas. Of these, 8,284 were offshore refugee visas and 7,268 were offshore special humanitarian program visas. Now, by way of comparison, the latest UNHCR figures show the United Kingdom resettled 1,768 refugees and France 700 refugees in 2015. Now, this fair and equitable approach has resulted in 15,552 visas under our offshore humanitarian program for people who are patiently waiting overseas. It means 8,640 visas for people displaced by conflict in Syria and Iraq. This is our largest offshore humanitarian program, since 1983, and it is something of which all Australians should be proud. A consequence of the enduring nature, though, of Labor's legacy issues has been their continued dominance of the public discourse surrounding the immigration and border protection portfolio. It has unfairly stained the department, and it has sucked oxygen from key messages and significant achievements by our 14,000 exceptional officers and staff. But that is in the process of changing. The resources of government have for too long been diverted to dealing with the aftermath of past mistakes. An Australian Public Service Commission capability review was warning as long ago as 2012 that the then emphasis on handling IMAs risked being at the expense of other core business aspects of the department. For example, Labor cut $734 million and 700 jobs from the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service to pay for their border policy failures. Strengthening the department has long been a part of our agenda. A Rand Corporation report released today has found that the government's integration of the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service and the Department of Immigration and Border Protection has resulted in an increase in operational effectiveness and efficiency. Now, further to this, we have vastly improved border enforcement with the creation of the Australian Border Force. As we progressively alleviate the burden of Labor's legacy, we are freeing up resources and shifting our focus to the challenges of the future. The Immigration and Border Protection Policy Imperative should strive to fulfil dual responsibilities of policing our borders and driving economic growth. There are new and evolving threats on the horizon that we must be prepared to encounter, and there are also emerging opportunities that we must seize. In 2016, some of the greatest challenges and opportunities we face rest on the dual-edged sword of ever-increasing volumes. Confluence of events including technological innovation, the rise of budget airlines, and an increasingly affluent and mobile Asian middle class has resulted in rapidly increasing numbers of people, goods and funds transiting our borders. Government must ensure that Australia is well placed to embrace the possibilities and mitigate the risks of volume. Getting it wrong will result in both squandered opportunities and exposure to great risk for our nation. In our temporary visa program, the scale of the challenge is significant. In just the last 5 years, the number of international travellers arriving in Australia has grown by approximately 24%, with ABF officers processing more than 40 million international air and sea passengers in 2015-16. By 2018-19, international air and sea passenger and crew numbers are expected to increase by 23% over 2014-15 levels. Now, the benefits of these booming numbers have been substantial, with an additional $5.4 billion expended in Australia by international visitors alone in the year to March. Temporary visitors to our country make a strong and growing contribution to our national economy, and we must facilitate and encourage the movement of a growing global pool of travellers, skilled workers, students and business people. The challenge that comes with these expanding figures is an inevitable increase in the incidence of criminals and terrorists attempting to cross our borders. Beyond the dangers of transnational criminals, we know that terrorist groups such as Daesh are exploiting the mass movements of the international migrant crisis to move materials and personnel to supporting terrorism. They are using chaos and volume as a cover. Just 2 days ago, 3 Syrian nationals who travelled through Turkey and Greece using fake passports were arrested in a series of pre-dawn terror raids in northern Germany. The men were allegedly assisted by the same smuggler organisation behind the Paris attacks. To more effectively deal with the challenges of volume in our temporary migration program, the government is implementing innovative reforms. We have rolled out smart gates at the border, utilising biometric technology, and we're implementing a new visa risk assessment capability known as VRA to detect in a better way travellers who may pose a threat. Excuse me. Now, once in place, this $100 million investment in the VRA program will bring together several disparate sources of intelligence to perform real-time, broad-ranging threat detection and automated risk profiling. This will increase efficiency and facilitate earlier identification far from our shores of visa applicants who may pose a threat to our nation. VRA aims to harness the power of big data to prevent potential terrorists from ever boarding a plane, with the department granting 7.7 million temporary visas in 2015-16, the importance of VRA into the future is very clear. As a further line of defence, the government has also established Australian Border Force counter-terrorism units, which are now in place at all 8 of Australia's major international airports. These dedicated teams conducted almost 200,000 real-time assessments and over 13,000 airport patrols in 2015-16. Their work has already resulted in potential foreign fighters and miners being prevented from leaving for conflict zones. They are helping Australia meet her international obligations not to import or export terror. As the world changes, the volume of cargo crossing international borders is also rapidly increasing. The value of global cross-border trade has grown exponentially from $296 billion in 1950 to $16 trillion US dollars in 2015. Australia's two-way trade in goods and services was worth nearly $670 billion in 2015, and the coalition government has long appreciated the value of international trade. We've secured a trifecta of landmark free trade agreements with China, Japan and Korea. And Prime Minister Turnbull and Prime Minister May recently announced their ambitions for a free trade agreement between Australia and a post-Brexit Britain. As our businesses profit from these arrangements, our trade volume of course grows. In the last year, Australia processed more than 3 million sea cargo consignments and approximately 35 million air cargo consignments. We inspected more than 50 million international mail items in the same period. Sea and cargo reports processed are predicted to increase by 14 and 26% respectively on 2014-15 figures by 2018-19. An inherent downside of growing cross-border trade is a potential increase in illicit trade, including in drugs, tobacco and firearms. The department continues to detect and seize large quantities of these and other types of illicit cargo. On the 19th of August, we officially launched the Australian Trusted Trader program, which aims to address the challenges of these volumes and improve the international competitiveness of Australian businesses. Now, Trusted Trader is a groundbreaking step forward in international trade facilitation. The program bolsters the facilitation and border security through incentivising industry self-compliance. It imposes a strict accreditation process that has the effect of creating two streams of trade: known low-risk entities on the one hand and unknown or high-risk entities on the other. Australian Border Force officers are then able to focus their detection efforts on higher-risk cargo. The end result is an intelligence and risk-based approach to volume that allows us to more efficiently target resources. And beyond improving screening methods, the program will benefit our nation in other ways. The program will deliver a $2.9 billion direct benefit to industry partners and is expected to provide an increase in household consumption of more than $2 billion over the next decade. Now, volume is not the only challenge facing us in immigration and border protection. While economic and national security issues are central to my portfolio, so is social cohesion. Who migrates to this country and the circumstances under which they do so has more than an economic impact. It has an impact on Australian society and the way in which we all live. In the post-war era, our nation has been shaped and strengthened by a program of managed migration that has included some 850,000 refugees. But it's also clear, including from the citizenship consultation conducted in our first term, that Australians seek reassurance about the future and purpose of our program and those who come. It is a privilege to migrate permanently to Australia, and those who are fortunate enough to do so have a responsibility to respect our laws and our institutions. Community expectations should also be met, including with regard to the English language and shared values, which are essential for economic participation and social inclusion. This is especially true for those who would later seek to become Australian citizens. Australia's temporary and permanent migration policies and programs must serve our national interest. Our visa system is overly complex and supported by ageing infrastructure. While efforts have been made to improve the user experience, work to simplify and reform the system must go further to better position us to deal with the increasing demand from travellers. A reformed visa system must better support our tourism and education sectors. We must be supportive of employers in addressing skill shortages and growing productivity, and the system must also keep our country secure. This means denying entry to or removing those whose values or behaviour falls below acceptable community standards. As Immigration Minister, I've used my powers under Section 501 of the Migration Act to cancel 283 visas for offences of assault, 265 for other violent offences, 217 for drug offences and 133 for child sexual offences. We've cancelled 24 for murder, 11 for manslaughter and 63 for rape. We've cancelled or refused the visas of 105 non-citizens known to be members or associates of outlaw motorcycle gangs, the biggest distributors of illicit drugs in this country. I've cancelled more visas on character grounds than any previous minister, and the community is a safer place as a result. The place of migrants in the labour market is likewise a matter of community interest. Each year, around 130,000 places are made available for skilled persons and their families to migrate permanently to this great country. And around 60,000 places are available for families of Australians to do the same. These numbers are substantial and capable of having a significant impact on the labour force and welfare costs into the future. It is therefore vitally important that we carefully consider the policy settings for the permanent, skilled and family streams of the migration program. With the right settings, these new entrants to the labour market can be an effective supplement to the labour force and not a substitute for it. These areas of future reform, while significant, are only the beginning, and they provide a glimpse into the future of a government and a department that is finally overcoming the legacy of a disastrous period in Australian border security policy. We have taken great strides to reach this point and have faced significant strategic challenges along the way. Often what appears to be an easy choice can in fact be fraught with danger. We have made tough but necessary and fair decisions, knowing that they would set the nation on the right long-term path. That is what good governments do. In the weeks and months to come, the government will articulate our plans for the future of immigration and border protection. This department is one of the institutional foundations protecting and defending our nation in very uncertain times. Our positive forward agenda will lay the groundwork for both a stronger department and a stronger nation. If we are to have any chance of rising to the challenges of tomorrow, we must plan for the future and make the right decisions today. Thank you very much.
Well, Minister, thank you very much for that data-rich and calm walk through the range of issues which are broad indeed. And thank you also for agreeing to take some Q&A. I thought I might exercise the moderator's right, if I may, by asking the first question, and that's to ask you to offer some comments on Indonesia. I mean, it seems to me that clearly one of our interests is to do what we can to enhance Indonesia's capacity to manage its borders effectively as well. And I know this is a focus of Australian policy thinking too. So can you say a little bit about that relationship and about your aspirations for what we might be able to achieve in terms of bilateral cooperation?
Sure. Well, Peter, there is a lot that the department is already doing, and I commend in particular the Secretary and the Commissioner, the Deputy Secretaries, and also Major General Bottrell at an officials level in particular in this space, both operationally and in terms of the execution of public policy here. We have a very significant and long-standing relationship. There is the ability to reach out to counterparts in Indonesia, and that has built up over a long period of time. There's obviously a very close relationship, close working relationship between the Prime Minister and the President in Indonesia. The Minister for Trade and Investment is very keen to continue some of the preliminary discussions in terms of a greater exchange by way of two-way trade between our two countries. And we work bilaterally, particularly in the security space, in a way that is unprecedented, and necessarily so, because as we see foreign fighters returning from Syria and from Iraq, we need to work with neighbours within our region. And so it is important for relationships at a government level, at a ministerial level, but most importantly at an officials level, where we do have the ability as Indonesia does, to reach into the minds of our counterparts and to work together. And I think that is going to be increasingly important. And so there's a very good foundation and a lot of work that and cooperation that takes place that is beneath the radar. And it's a great credit to officials on both sides of the discussion.
Thank you, Minister. Well, now, folks, it's time for Q&A. Can I ask you to, in the usual way, put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, identify yourself, and then wait for a mic to be brought to you. I know we have a number of members of the press here as well. I'd ask your forbearance to give others in the audience to ask some questions too, and we'll start with this gentleman here.
Minister Dutton, my name is Sibel. I'm with German News Agency. In your speech, you've mentioned Germany at least twice. My question is, what is there something that Australia takes from German experience? Is there something to learn, especially since Germany took 1.1 million refugees last year, and you seem to comment on how it has devolved, how the situation has devolved there. Thank you very much.
Well, obviously, Australians, like everyone across the world, is watching a global phenomena. And as I pointed out before, 65 million people who are displaced. There are 6.5 million displaced internally in Syria alone. And the thought that the three major countries that provide permanent settlement, that is Australia, Canada and the United States, that we could take even a fraction of the 65 million is a nonsense. And we need to work in relation to a situation like Syria, for example, with countries like Jordan and Lebanon and other adjacent countries to provide support through camps, to provide education, to provide accommodation, and all of that which goes with providing a safe haven until people can then return back to a homeland when security has been restored. Now, Germany and many other countries across Europe have borne the brunt of those irregular movements, and as I said in my speech before, this is a problem not only for today and without precedent in recent times, but it is going to be a problem for a long period of time to come. And thought that people smugglers will go out of business or that somehow they'll substitute something else into their trade is ridiculous. They will see profit, and as we've seen here, they couldn't care less whether people go to the bottom of the ocean or they make land as people had intended to do. So there is a lot for us to observe in Europe, a lot of lessons to learn, and a lot of relationships that have been built over a long period of time where we exchange information. We have a significant exchange of information with Five Eyes partners and partners beyond that, and we have to understand that this is a problem for Europe, for the rest of the world, until global peace is delivered in a way that perhaps you can tell me it could be delivered. So it's a very difficult situation and will be for a long period of time to come.
Thank you, Ed. We have a question over here.
Thank you, Minister. I'm Brian Weston, and I'm working myself into retirement. So, my perspective is a bit different to what you've got here, and it reflects a personal experience. My late father-in-law was Polish. He was taken out of Poland at 15. He had a crucifix around his neck, and he was taken out of a liner and sent to Germany. After the war, he married a German girl. His father was in Siberia with the Russians, and they came to Australia. 1 month after they came to Australia, I've got his document from the CES. It says, "You've got a job, son. You're going to the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works. Here's what you paid, and we'll give you 10 shillings a day camping allowance." He paid tax from that day until the day he died. And his wife then continued as a self-funded retiree until a few years ago. They're a great example of how people transition into becoming productive Australians and committing to Australia. I think we have a real issue at the moment in transitioning the people that come in, both from refugees and immigration, into becoming productive Australian citizens. Have you got some thoughts on the scope of this problem and how are we trying to move forward and solve it? Because I know I have a very good friend who looks after refugees, and he has immense problems.
Brian, a couple of points. I met with the then UNHCR, the High Commissioner in Paris last year, and he complimented Australia on being, along with Canada, probably the best country in the world in terms of settlement services, the services that we provide. And there's a significant investment made, services delivered through the social services portfolio. But nonetheless, as you'd expect, a deep interaction with my department, and it's a whole of government effort otherwise. But the support that we provide, I think, is world class in that sense. Your point goes perhaps to something different, and this is a societal issue, not just an issue that might confront new arrivals into our country, because we do have a largely passive welfare system for people that want it to be that way. Now, the vast majority of people who come to our country will want to work hard, take the opportunity that's been afforded them, like your parents, work hard, provide for the next generation and subsequent generations to be well educated, to contribute to society and be amongst the best people that make up the 24 million in this country. So there is a lot that we can do in helping people gain employment. Recognition for prior learning is an issue, making sure that there is the ability to support families where they may have come from a culture before where women are treated differently than what we might expect in our own country. And there are complex issues around torture and trauma, and we provide support in relation to those counselling services, for example. So there is a lot that we do very well, but we know that people contribute most if they're of working age and are able-bodied, if they're in permanent employment and they provide the great example for children and society otherwise. That is true of any Australian, of any background, across the length and breadth of this country. So we can do more, I'm sure, but there are many great stories to tell, and obviously yours is one of them.
Let me invite more questions from the floor. Yes, please. Two at the back here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm also working towards retirement. I was just wondering, you talk about learning from history and the success of the Howard era policies, and that also included 2001, 2002, emptying the camps of processing centres on Nauru and Manus, roughly 1,600 people there, and bringing at least half of them, I think, to Australia. If we are looking at history and the lessons of history, I mean, that in that situation, there wasn't a resurgence of boats. It was still a very successful policy from then until, as you said, 2008. What is it that distinguishes today from the mid-2000s that we have to maintain this hard line of you will not come to Australia?
Well, all of the advice that I receive from any of the agency heads, from all of the people that sit around the National Security Committee of Cabinet, indicate to me that the worst outcome for us is to allow the people smugglers to convey a narrative that they have defeated the Australian government and that if you pay your money, you will end up in Australia. And Paul Keating had the problem when he introduced detention. John Howard laboured over how we could get children out of detention and did. There were 4 people in detention when Mr Howard left office in 2007, including no children. The difficulty is compounded today because we have advocates and criminals in syndicates across our region who are messaging to people in real time, telling them of political discussions here or quotes from state premiers, or the fact that somebody has come here for medical attention and because of an injunction hasn't been sent back to Nauru or to Manus, and they're using that in a different way to market the opportunity that may not have been there in the Howard years or in the Keating years. So we have to learn the lessons of history, and we have to have a contemporary view of how we can deal with the presence of these syndicates. One of the things I was struck by when I came into this portfolio was that the people smugglers, and perhaps it was a naive, in hindsight, a naive perception that I had, but that people smugglers, effectively had been crushed and defeated, and this problem would wane and we would be able to move on from it. But it's clear that this is just one business line in their model. They're running drugs or guns or prostitutes or sexual servitude, and when the opportunity arises, they will get back into this business. And as I said, the 29 boats, had they got through, thousands would have followed them. And the lesson that we learnt from history out of the 50,000 that arrived on the 800 boats was that was not a plateau. It didn't plateau at 50,000, it wasn't dropping off at 50,000, it was continuing to increase. And we have to learn the lessons from that, because, as I said before, one of the things I'm most proud of is having got children out of detention, but also being able to say hand on heart that we have not had a drowning at sea since the commencement of Operation Sovereign Borders. And I don't want to hear those stories that I've heard relayed to me already from Border Force officers and naval personnel of having pulled bodies out of the water. I don't ever want to return to those days, and I don't intend to, and it's why we do need a tough but fair message. And we'll provide third country settlements. We're working very, very intensely with a number of partners, but there is a very complex resolution to these issues that can't be just announced overnight. There are consequences that need to be worked through, and it is a very complex business in terms of what happens if you get a pull factor and you send a confused message. And we see that reported back through intelligence, and we've seen it demonstrated over the last 20 years of Australian migration history. So these are difficult decisions to make, and we should treat people humanely, and we do, and we should provide settlement for people. It's difficult if people know that they're not refugees and they're from a country where it is difficult to return those people back to. Then they refuse to take settlement packages. They're listening to advocates here saying, look, eventually you'll come to Australia, don't take that settlement package, don't go back to your country of origin. These are difficult issues and decisions to make.
Thank you. Now, I know there was another question there, but I'd like to, again, just ask you one myself, Peter, based on you linking it to your reference to organised crime, and that's about methamphetamine. I've spoken to many MPs on all sides of politics, and the impression I get is that this is emerging as sort of a terrible problem in almost every electorate in the country. Is this something that you think we're sort of getting on top of, or would you say this is a problem which is getting out of sort of law enforcement control at the moment, and again, strategies to deal with that situation?
Well, Peter, I think it is an issue where the Commissioner will be able to point to figures shortly, but where we have had an increase in the number of detections, in the number of in the quantity of detections. We've got, as I said before, the Trusted Trader program that allows us to concentrate on higher risk, intelligence-led investigations and detections and inspections. So we can expect, from our perspective, to do more in this space and be even more successful into the future. So there is a border protection element to it, there's a law enforcement element to it, and obviously there's a health element to it. Sometimes I think it's easy for us to think we've lost control of a situation, or that somehow there's a better alternative, but these are, again, complex matters. In a former life, I remember some of the most difficult days delivering death messages to parents of young children who had overdosed, and it's an horrific task, and for families that will never ever recover. They're the ones I think that you think about when we are making greater investments into border protection, into law enforcement, into the health space, so that we've got a whole of government effort to deal with what is a significant issue. There are significant syndicates across Southeast Asia and elsewhere that see us as a lucrative market, and indeed right across the world. So there's a lot of work that Border Force is doing, but a lot more that we can do as well.
Now we might go for one last question at the back here.
Hi, my name is Dulcie. I'm an intern here with ASPI. I just had a question about your comment today about Australia being open to resettling people from Nauru to New Zealand. And I guess my question, in the past we've sort of not been engaged in that buffer due to the fact that we didn't want to send the wrong message to people smugglers. What sort of changed since then, and what could that solution maybe look like?
I'll deal with it very directly. There has been no change. So the ABC was running a report this afternoon which we explained to them was factually incorrect. I did an interview with Al Jazeera a few days ago, which must have been broadcast in recent hours, and there was a question that was put to me, which the ABC hadn't picked up. The question asked if there was an arrangement entered into between Nauru and New Zealand, what would your response be in relation to that? My response effectively was that if there was an arrangement entered into, that ultimately it's an issue for both of those countries. Now, we have been very clear about the fact that people smugglers do see New Zealand as a destination country, and the proposal that was put forward by then Prime Minister Gillard was essentially a recipe for getting into Australia through the back door of New Zealand. And I've noticed this afternoon that the Prime Minister New Zealand, Mr Key, and my counterpart, Mr Woodhouse, have both said that they are open to discussion with Australia, but they wouldn't see any bilateral arrangement with Nauru, as we would expect. And our position remains unchanged, and that is that we are not going to enter into arrangements which provide a pull factor, which allow people smugglers, again, to get a narrative up that people should pay money again and they're back into business of getting people into our country. We will continue negotiations with third countries, and when we land something, it will be done in a very sophisticated way, and we will talk about some of that publicly and other parts not, which will allow us to continue to defeat the people smugglers, to negate the pull factor, but to allow people, in particular women and children, to get off Nauru into third country settlements. But I've been very clear in my response to the ABC this afternoon that there's no change in my position or that of the government.
Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I know there was a gentleman who wanted to ask one question, but we're right on time, and I try to be a stickler as a timekeeper, so maybe in the reception afterwards. Can I ask you please to thank the Minister? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Minister, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to come and give us what would be called a data-rich speech. I think one which shows the breadth of the issues which your department has to deal with. As we saw at the very beginning, there are issues in your portfolio which give rise to excitement and a bit of undergraduate emotion. But I think there's a lot to be said for calmness in terms of the effective delivery of messages. I'm particularly struck by the volume of issues that, or the volume of data, of processing, of visas, of containers that has to be, it seems to be ever increasing and has to be factored into how the portfolio manages itself. I don't doubt that this is going to create significant data handling problems, the need for better quality risk analysis in order to understand how we can continue to facilitate effective trade and people movements. So there's no question that in a portfolio of great complexity, I think you've got your work cut out for you over the next few years. Again, thank you very much for a thoughtful presentation, and can I ask you to please thank the Minister one more time?